Bonjour, Joe.
Guten Tag, Ibi. Wie geht's?
Ça va bien, merci.
No.
Okie dokie.
So today we're talking about language learning, which I've never been amazing at, but specifically so-called gamification and language learning apps. So we've played a few of these, haven't we?
Played, used.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where the sticking point is, really, because are you playing a game? Are you learning something? Are you just learning to play that specific game? What have we been playing?
We've been trying out a whole bunch of apps. So on my list here I have Duolingo, which probably most people will have heard of. And then also some less known ones. We have Memrise, which is very similar to Duolingo. LingoLegends. And then we have Influent and Earthlingo.
Yes. And these all sort of represent different ways that you could put language learning into an app or try to gamify language learning, right? Yeah. And I think we've both probably spent more time on Duolingo than any of these.
Yeah, because that's the one I have, or we both have used outside of trying to make this episode.
Yeah, I was learning German in it because I learnt German at school between the ages of like 11 and 16, I think, and occasionally dip back into it, but it's very hard to learn that way, and I think we'll probably talk about some of the reasons why that is. And you were learning Swedish last time you used it. And so do you have, as both a linguist and as someone who has learnt more than one language, right? Do you have any sort of starting points of things that you would talk about in relation to Duolingo? Because I feel like that's the one that most people will have experience with.
Yeah. It applies to Duolingo, but actually I think it applies to all of the ones that we've looked at.
Interesting.
And that's the focus on vocabulary.
And so by vocabulary you mean you're learning words for things and actions, but you're not necessarily learning the grammar of how those go together to make sentences that make sense.
Well, you do get to a point where very often where you're asked to form sentences, but there is usually no explicit instruction on grammar aspects.
Right.
So from learning German, for instance, you will know that we have different genders for nouns, right? So we have 3 different articles that go with different nouns instead of just the. And then that's also reflected in things like adjectives, right? The endings on adjectives might change depending on what gender the noun is. So you wouldn't really get a slide or a task on Duolingo or any of those apps that goes, okay, we're going to do a grammar lesson. There are 3 genders in German, and these are what the articles are, and these are how adjective endings relate to the different grammatical genders, right? It's all, you learn implicitly that a specific noun goes with a specific article, right? But you don't really get an instruction on the underlying reasons and rules for that.
Yeah.
And that is something that I have noticed when doing a bit of Swedish and a bit of French as well on Duolingo, and then I've also noticed it in the other apps. It's just, as someone who has learned languages before and as someone who's a linguist, I feel like it's all well to do a bit of the implicit grammar, but there needs to be, at least for me, and I think for many learners, there needs to be a bit more focus on explicitly stating what certain grammar rules are.
Right, yeah.
Because otherwise you might never really understand why it is that it's der Hund but die Katze.
Yeah. Well, we do understand, and it's because cats are girls and dogs are boys.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just how that works.
Yeah.
But I think I'd be interested if any listeners to this have like really long experience with Duolingo going back since it started, because I did root around to try and find a change log and I haven't been able to find one. But I know that when I've discussed this with people, I have had people say, oh, Duolingo used to have this grammar learning section and now they don't see it anymore. It's been taken out or whatever. And that might depend on how far you are or what language you're learning in or whatever. But I do think there is this issue with trying to do this kind of education in the context of a free app.
Yeah.
That is like, you know, every free app is working on one of two business models, really. And, you know, I've spent a couple of years working in mobile games, and you have a business model that is based around, you know, the app is free and there's something in the app that you watch ads to get, or that you have a business model based around selling currency, or you have a blended version of those two things. And the thing about those business models is you're really trying to retain as many users as you can for as long as you can, and then like frustrate them to the point that they give you some money, right?
Yeah.
And that means that's really fundamentally at odds with getting people to do something hard they don't want to do, right? And I sort of see the same problem with other kind of free online learning resources. Like, it's a problem with YouTube, really, that for someone making educational content on YouTube to reach a big enough audience, they always have to be doing everything at beginner level. And as soon as you try to go to intermediate or master's level in what you're teaching, you narrow your audience so much that you then can't make money from the audience, because you're not like talking to a big enough group of people. And I think Duolingo seems to struggle with this problem, that it just has a particular way of teaching, in scare quotes, right, quote unquote teaching, which it knows works and makes people happy. There is something about, oh, today I've learned 10 new words,
versus today I tried to wrap my head around
verb conjugation,
and maybe I'm a little better now, but I can't really tell.
The app made me feel stupid, right? And it's not based around that. And I think like Duolingo is really interesting from a marketing point of view, right? Because they have this like character for Duo, that Duo is like really aggressive and will like kidnap you if you don't if you break your streak. Although
apparently it's dead now.
I heard about that. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, let us know if you've worked out what's going on with Duo. They did a game jam a year or two ago on Roblox, where they gave all of the Roblox developers like loads of free assets of Duo and stuff, and they would just like do what you want with Duo, and loads of people made like scary horror games with Duolingo chasing, which is a piece of marketing genius, I think. But one of the things that I think Duolingo does do very well, that I think some of the other apps we looked at don't do very well, is the sort of the creative direction is sort of child friendly, but it doesn't look like it's designed specifically for children. So you're kind of engaging with all these colourful characters and stuff, but you don't feel like you're using a children's app. Whereas I think some of the other games we looked at really do struggle with working out who they're for, and I can't really work out if that's because, you know, they've developed an app for children and it's not really aimed at adults, or if they're just like, you know, have artists and creative directors that just aren't as skilled as the people in that team. So I think Duolingo represents one way of quote unquote teaching language. And you said Memrise was very similar?
Yeah, it's very similar. It's also basically, it's basically streak based, right? You have different kinds of sort of modules where you learn different words, and you sort of score up to what degree you have learned a specific word by doing it multiple times in different kinds of exercises. And then you have the streak system of you've opened the app X days in a row. That's sort of it. Which brings me to something that I wanted to hear your take on, and that's this notion of gamification.
Yeah, so listeners might be familiar with this term, and it's used in a lot of different ways. You can use it in a very general term of like, how do we gamify this thing, right? So you're trying to make a board game about a historical event, and you're gamifying it. You're basically just doing game design. You're taking something that already exists and turning it into a game, and that's what gamification is. The way it's used in business is a little bit more buzzwordy, I would say. And I would say, you know, the idea of taking something and trying to turn it into a engaging learning experience by making it into a game, it can happen on a couple of different levels, right? And one is to basically create a game about the thing you want to learn, and by becoming immersed in that set of processes or whatever, you learn stuff.
Yeah.
And this is what Ian Bogost's book, Serious Games, or it's called Serious Games. It's about a theory of procedural rhetoric, which is the idea that games present models of things and situations, and you learn how the world works based on how it's modeled in this interactive thing, right? So to give you an example, when I was about 7 or 8, I learnt how capitalism worked. Because I was playing the game...
That's quite early.
Yeah, I know. I was playing the game Theme Park, and I learnt that if you put the salt content of your French fries up, then people bought more drinks, right? And this sort of taught me through procedure, through the way the system worked, that people running businesses are operating in a way to maximise profit. And then I walked in the living room, and I said, "Mum, Dad, I understand how capitalism works now because of Theme Park." But that's an example where the game is not explicitly educational, but it's presenting a model of how a thing works.
Yeah.
And then by engaging with that, you're sort of placed in a position to work things out for yourself. And lots of simulation games have this quality, like SimCity has this. The way that gamification tends to be used in a sort of business context, and you have to remember here that it is aligning with these kind of free-to-play mobile apps where the goal is to get as many people on your service as possible, because only 1% of them are ever going to pay money, right?
Yeah.
So all of the free-to-play mobile apps operate on this business model, and they used to call them whales, which was like the one user in 100 that spends like £400 a year in your app or whatever. So
that's a very short acronym for a very long...
No, it's not. It's not an acronym. It's like if you think of it as a fishing metaphor, right? So you've got minnows and
I
fish.
thought you were going to... Okay.
No, and it's Captain Ahab going after the whale, right? So you're building this whole thing based around it being free, and you know that 99% of people are not going to give you any money. And then some people who have a lot of disposable income and poor impulse control are going to give you lots of money, right? And so something like Duolingo is still operating on that business model. And what that tends to mean is that the gamification in Duolingo is all happening at the level of sort of progression and collection.
Yeah.
Of like you say, "Oh, it told me I learned 10 words today." Did you really learn 10 words? Well, you scored a particular way in this thing that was set up. And the game here isn't really in the moment-to-moment learning and using of the words. It's in the maintaining the streak and the seeing bars go up and so on. So there's a lot of sort of applied behaviorist psychology used in these apps to do with things like loss aversion. You know, streaks are a big one. Loss aversion and loads of free games use this. It's not just language learning apps. The idea that you need to log in every day and get a present, and if you don't, and they do this for various different reasons. So, you know, online competitive games have these login rewards, and it's because if the amount of players playing their game falls, then their game becomes worse because there's less people online to matchmake with and so on. So they have all this gamification that's built in to keep you engaged. And some of that may be in service to the learning, because doing a thing every day is good practice, and some of it is in service to the business model. And I guess the features that have stuck around for a long time in an app like Duolingo are the ones that are ticking both boxes, right?
Yeah.
So anything that might be actually better for people's learning, like you say, like prompts to learn grammar or more explicit instructions on certain things that you can't learn that way, go out the window or don't get included, because they don't help retain and engage users, because most people don't want to do that stuff because it's too hard.
I'm always thinking, especially things like Duolingo, those kinds of apps, the term gamification gets applied to those, and then you think about, well, what does gamification actually mean, right? So if it's a game, it's something that you play, right? And a game is something that is fun, right? And then you look at something like Duolingo and you think, well, is this fun?
Yeah, and
am I playing that? You're not really, right? Because it's gamification in the sense that you are competing with yourself and others for how many days in a row can I do that, right? That's mostly the main aspect. And then it's, completing certain modules or whatever. But it's gamification in like such a loose way.
Yeah, and I think if you look into the sort of examples that I used in the literature, there's a lot of stuff around corporate training of like, oh, how can we make the safety training at McDonald's more engaging and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So a lot of it boils down to we have an activity that people don't want to do, and there's this nebulous notion of fun, and if we can work out a way to sprinkle fun on this activity, then people will engage with the activity.
Yeah. It's basically, in any learning environment, if you have a form of learning that's not just one person telling another person, or lecturing basically, or a person reading the content, anything that's a learning activity that's something else than that, group activities or whatever it might be, right, is then considered a gamified way of learning and teaching, right, which is extremely loose. And then it's not just a game thing, right, an online game thing or an app thing. It's like if I teach my students about like 101 linguistics, right, I might do that in ways that's not just me lecturing. I might do that in ways that's giving them tasks that they have to do in groups or individually, and then it's like in the business world we then use the term gamification very broadly because it is one of those buzzwords.
Yeah, and it's also a way of trying to make the cheaper way of doing something feel like it's better than the more expensive way of doing something. So if you imagine, like the example you just gave of, oh, here are all the different ways you can teach something. The whole point of being in a classroom with an educator is the educator can read the classroom. They can say, oh, my cohort this year is slightly different, and they can adjust how they teach. They might not be able to adjust what they teach because of however the course is structured, but they're able to adjust what they're teaching lesson to lesson and go, okay, people didn't understand that, let's revisit it, let's play a game around that, and so on. And like teaching digitally is often like a poorer version of that because the thing can't respond to you. Now, apps like Duolingo are very like tuned into your specific user profile, but you're not learning in a group with other people, so there are ways in which it can't respond to you. And I would think in parallel to this, things like BetterHelp, like digitized therapy, where that's probably a great service for some people. I'm glad that it exists. Maybe it's particularly helpful for people in certain situations, like their social anxiety is so bad that they don't want to go and see a therapist in person or whatever. But there was this idea in sort of digital sociology, if you go back about 20 years, of like, have you ever heard the term digital divide?
Don't know.
It was like the idea that access to technology and how much people know about technology will be like the big class definer of the coming years. Yeah. And it's obviously true to an extent, like people who have particular skills in technology get better jobs and so on. But also what's tended to happen is like the digital version of something becomes the cheap version, and the version where you get access to a person is the more expensive version, right? Because it stands to reason that the cheap version is like a recorded thing of someone's expertise, whereas like having a one-to-one tutor is like the most expensive way of learning something. Learning something in a classroom is less expensive. Learning something from a video is less expensive, and so on. So these kind of like digital ways of learning end up being at the kind of cheaper end of the pile, and especially when they're based on this business model of like, we give you the thing free and we hope you give us some money when you want to save your streak or something like that. So what you were saying a moment about gamification and the different things this can mean, I think this leads us in nicely into talking about some of the other games. And LingoLegends was the second game I played on this list, and it's like a very extreme version of what gamification could mean. Of like, it's almost like they've seen Duolingo and said, this game isn't gamey enough.
This game is in fact not a game at all.
So what we're going to do is we're going to make this, but actually make it a game,
Yeah.
which I sort of empathise to a degree. And I've one of the types of gamified app I did use all the way through my PhD. So from like 2012 to 2015, I was using an app called Habitica, which is like a habit tracking app.
Okay.
That gives you points and like little loot, and you dress up a guy and stuff. So I do see the value in this kind of stuff, but I always personally want it to feel more gamey. I want there to be a little bit of fantasy, and Duolingo doesn't have that. It's kind of characters that, you know, it's cartoony, but they're real world people. There's not a layer of fantasy in there.
No, you don't learn how to go shopping for dragon eggs, for instance.
Yeah, that would be good. I would learn a lot quicker if there were more dragons involved. That's what we need. More dragons and robots. But LingoLegend is kind of further in that direction, in the sense that they've mashed together a particular way of doing sort of fantasy role-playing combat.
Yeah.
It's got a fantasy world, right? There are little characters, and you go and fight in a woods, and then you go and fight in a cave.
You have a farm.
I don't remember.
Yeah, you have a farm.
Well.
Yeah. You got some animals that you care for. It's kind of Farmville-y, right? Yeah, you get resources,
there's
and then
a farm,
you trade.
and then there's fighting and training. So the way the fighting works is interesting, because if you've played something like Slay the Spire, where you have a handful of cards and you play them, and some of the cards give you blocking and some of the cards add attack, and you have to look at what the enemy's going to do that turn and go, okay, I'm going to focus most of my attempts on defense or on attack. So you have this randomness coming from drawing from a deck of cards, which you build up over time, which gives you your character progression, and then the moment-to-moment piloting of playing the cards. But the way that they make the language work is that basically, in order to trigger the cards you've chosen to play, you have to do these language quiz type things.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found interesting, and it might just be a product of it being made by a smaller team than Duolingo, and maybe it's a bit less balanced, but I felt like the range of difficulty in the language questions, even very early in the game, in the first couple of hours, was really wide. Because there are some questions where it gives you like a full sentence, which might be like 9 or 12 syllables long.
Yeah.
And you have the syllables as jigsaw pieces, and you have to like move them together. So you're using a bit of intuition about, okay, I'm learning German, so which way round do I and E usually go together? And you're sort of... And I thought that was a really interesting... Obviously, we don't have any like hard data on what is the efficacy of this type of question versus this type of question, but I felt like the range of the types of question I was being asked was already making the game more interesting for me than Duolingo. And I think that's because Duolingo is so focused on content and not structure, or vocabulary and not structure, that it is really just a matter of, if you know what this word means, you answer the question, and if you don't, you don't.
Yeah.
Whereas some of these questions were a little bit more structural and had to do with like not filling in the gaps with words, but actually having to structure the entire sentence out of a possible syllable. So I found that interesting. But the problem, there were a couple of problems it had, but one big problem was that it was so slow. If you think of, you know, you're fighting a combat and you're playing cards to fight a combat, and if that didn't have the language element in, that might be a little fight that takes 3 minutes.
Yeah.
But everything you do is interrupted by a language question. And then the outcome of each move is just not big enough. So it just felt so like such a slog to get through one thing of combat. And I think some of that would just be numerical tweaking. And then the other issue is kind of what I was mentioning earlier of, like, the art direction makes it look like it's a game aimed at 10 to 12-year-olds.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't see adults getting into it. You know, it needed to look like World of Warcraft or Dark Souls or something.
Yeah.
And
but even then, see, because I had to go at it as well, and I just found it, as someone who likes learning languages and who likes RPGs, this did nothing for me on either of those fronts. Because, I don't know.
Again, the RPG layer of it isn't particularly cool, because it's very cutesy and cartoony, and again looks like it's aimed at kids, right? But
even if it wasn't, if I want to play an RPG, I want to play an RPG, and I don't also want to...
Which brings... there was something... We were talking about this the other day, and one of the things I brought up with you is... how do all of these things compare to just playing a game in the language you want to learn, right?
Yeah,
so
or watching a film in, in the language.
Which I'm sure you've done when you've been learning languages, and other people I know when they're learning languages, they'll watch a film and they'll either have both the audio and subtitles in the language they're learning, or they might have one in the language they know
Although
and the other.
Although it has to be said, usually you need to have at least already some level of linguistic competence in that language for it to work, right? You wouldn't just start with putting on a Russian film if you don't know a single thing about Russian.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a way of doing sort of semi-immersed language learning, like you would do if you went to a place and just talked to people in a cafe, but it's a bit more unidirectional.
You know, also listening to music. When I was a teenager, I learned loads of English through listening to music, and then, you know, going on the internet and looking up what the words actually are.
Is that why you've got a Sheffield accent now? You don't really. It'd be funny if you had developed a living in Austria with a Sheffield accent when you speak English. There are ways of. I just wonder, with all of these things, it's like it's marketing this kind of benefit it's going to have for you, and I just wonder if there are things you can do that are more fun where you learn the language better, like just like playing a game that you're familiar with, and you know where all the menu options are and stuff, and then switching the language on that. So
imagine
if you want to read the tooltips,
but change it to German.
Oh,
right?
I did that for a month or two.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it's really interesting because you've got all of these weird concepts like divine shield.
Yeah.
Like, what is that in German? Oh, it's going to be a portmanteau word that's like 32 characters long and breaks all the menus, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I did do that once, and it's quite interesting because you know, if it's a game you're really familiar with, you know all the language, you know the position of the language, you know that this box here will say hero and this box here will say spell.
Granted, it doesn't give you much vocabulary that's really useful in the real world.
I had a friend I used to work with a long time ago who was in the Communist Party in the 80s, and he said he used to go to like rallies and lectures in Spain, and he's been a Spanish teacher for a very long time, and he would go to these lectures and he'd be talking in Spanish about like workers' revolutions and stuff, and then he wouldn't be able to remember anything like functional to use about like asking where the toilet is or anything in the menu in a restaurant, because his Spanish was so confined to this one domain, right? So I can imagine, that's the problem with learning a language from a traditional game, is you're just going to know how to say divine shield and talk about damage all the time. Why is this person always going on about damage and poisoning people and all of this stuff? We've looked at two types of app, right? So you've got the Duolingo style that I think most people would be familiar with. We had this super gamey style of LingoLegend, where it's like we're trying to recreate a game and just insert a quiz into it at key points, so that in order to do well in the game, you have to do well in this language intervention. Yeah. And I mean, your experience of that is kind of, it still has most of the same problems as Duolingo. My experience of it is you're ruining a perfectly good game by slowing it down with quiz questions. Yeah.
And then we had a third kind.
A third, and perhaps the most bizarre kind.
Yeah, but also maybe the most entertaining, at least for a short period of time.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there. The secret third type of game we discovered was there were two of these we played, but there's probably more. And again, they do have the problem, even more so actually, of being very focused on vocab, but specifically nouns. And this is really a product of the type of game. But basically, in this type of game, you walk around in an environment and you interact with objects, and it tells you what the object is called. Yeah. And there's one called, what was the...
Influent?
So, yeah.
And the other was Earthlingo.
Influent, which is a terrible name because it implies that you're never going to become fluent when playing this. But this is like, you are a man in an apartment and you walk around and you click on stuff and he just says what it is. Yeah. And there are some other mini games later in the game. I didn't get far enough, but I could see from the adverts there were like flying a toy plane around the apartment and stuff. And it looked like these were where the verb learning happened, right? And where the sentences happened. And that was interesting, and it was at least kind of sort of joyful to interact with. And there's something about it being a physical toy and then the language being this sort of thing. I guess my experience of playing with this for about like half an hour or so was like the language was able to just sort of wash over me because I was physically involved with the game, right? Whereas the experience with Duolingo, it's like you're very, very directly interacting with the language through an interface. And LingoLegend was kind of the same. It's like, here is an interface with words in, and you're very conscious of what's going on.
Yeah, and also the thing with LingoLegend was that you have your little farm, you gather resources, you practice your words, and then you go out and you fight and you play your like battle cards of like using your axe and your shield or whatever, and then those quiz questions come up and they have nothing to do with the world, right? It's like I'm trying to use my battle axe and it's asking me what telephone means. Yes. Right?
Yeah, that would be a great modification to that exact same style of game. Take the same concept and just basically have like a word cloud, right?
Yeah.
So when you use your axe and you use your axe or your shield and it goes, okay, I've got an axe and a shield, I've got an attack and a defend, and I'm going to pick from all of these available sentences something that is related to what is happening in the fiction of the game. Like, I defend with my shield, or it could be just something loosely related to what is happening in the game, and it would have been so much more compelling and interesting.
Yeah.
But the experience with playing Influent was that it felt like the language was sort of washing over me at a slightly more subconscious level because I'm playing around with the toy and moving around in the physical environment. And I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing.
Yeah.
But it was a very different experience. And the other one, which was super goofy, was called Earthlingo, which feels like a play on Duolingo, but also a play on Earthling. And this kind of looks like a Roblox game. You've got like a goofy little alien who's crashed on Earth. And you're walking around. But what this does with noun learning is you walk around this human environment a little bit. And you sort of tag a couple of objects, like it might be 5 or 8 or something. And then after you've picked these objects and it's told you what they're called in your target language and you've, mouthed it along or whatever, then it gives you a quiz and you've got this really interesting sort of interaction between linguistic memory and spatial memory because you have to run back to where you saw the object in order to confirm it.
It's basically telling you go find the telephone booth and then you have to go run back to where the telephone booth was and like tap it.
Yes, and some objects are really plentiful because it's like a street light or a car, and some are in very specific places. So I kept getting told to go for a tyre, and then I had to remember where the mechanics was and go and look outside the tyre. I think that's a really interesting way of bringing different types of memory together because we know like there are these tricks that people do with like card counting and like the memory palace trick that you get in there's a representation of it in the Hannibal Lecter books where Hannibal Lecter has a memory palace, but it is actually
Sherlock does as well.
It's a mnemonic technique that you can learn where you spatialize a memory and it helps you to remember sequences of things. And there's actually there's a sequence in one of Derren Brown's books where he teaches you how to card count and memorize the sequence of a deck of cards by building a spatial story around it in your head. So I think that game in particular was perhaps not executing its idea as well as it could possibly be executed, but it's definitely an interesting idea. The problem I found was because the art style was so like low poly, it's like everything looks like it's made out of Duplo, right? And that meant that some of the words I was just like so Wohnung in German, it's like an apartment building, isn't it? It's like a dwelling, like an apartment.
It's apartment,
and it's like flat. Which of these skyscrapers is supposed to be a Wohnung?
They're
all just like. They all have three features.
But also, a single building wouldn't be a Wohnung because the Wohnung is the flat, right? It would be apartment building, which wasn't even the word that they were asking for, right?
Exactly. And then another issue that came up in that game and in the previous one is that a lot of these games are using a sort of AI generated, or what? It's not AI, whatever you want to call it, like a digitally generated voice to enunciate the words, and you pointed out that some of the German pronunciations were wrong.
I mean, it was mostly like the word stress was off,
right? Which is a classic problem with robots. They just don't know where to put the stress in their sentence.
No.
We've learnt this. We've learnt this so many times. We know it from Fallout. The Matt Berry being Mr. Handy in the Fallout TV show.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's the king of putting the stress in the wrong part of your voice.
Yeah, I like it when he does it.
He's the only person that gets a pass. Matt Berry, if you're listening, then just we want you to know that you're allowed to keep doing it.
Yeah.
But these voices on these language learning games, they should stop. Because it's making us learn language
I
wrong.
would like Matt Berry doing some language teaching. I'm not sure which languages he can teach, if he knows any other than English, but...
Well, I think what we should get is like hyper-specific games that teach a language in a way that makes sense with the fiction of the game, right? So we're talking about the issue with the card game where the sentences is like asking me about telephone and I'm supposed to be fighting a goblin in the woods. Like, what if there was a program where you could learn Polish and it was just with The Witcher, right? Amazing, right? Or you can learn a language in a very sort of native way using a character from a game and gameplay from a game.
But again, it has to also balance the need for real world relevance of vocabulary, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like, where is the swamp witch?
I'm
going to cut off her head and give it to the mayor.
Yeah. That's
quite a helpful phrase to be able to say in Polish.
Maybe.
I don't know. I think that could have some usage. One of the things I wanted to ask you on this episode before we wrap up would be, I think we've identified lots of potential problems with language learning games. So there is a lack of attention to grammar, and there's lots of reasons for that. One might be that we just haven't found out how to teach it yet. One is maybe just that it's...
I don't think that's true. I think people in the real world who are real teachers teach grammar all the time.
Yeah. One is that it's the not fun part.
Yeah. And
particularly if you have a business model based on being a freebie, then you try and avoid putting that kind of stuff in your game. And some of it is this lack of embeddedness. You know, you're not interacting with anyone else who's speaking. You're just sort of interacting with the language in a really abstract way of like, here is a sentence rather than here is an utterance you say to someone else to find something out and then they respond to you. I mean, Duolingo does have a little bit of those like back and forth conversations, but I kind of wish they were a larger percentage.
Everything is inconsequential though, apart from you losing your streak.
Yeah.
You know?
But you know that your Duo does those little tests where you get told a story and you get asked comprehension, and sometimes you have the conversations.
Yeah.
I would much prefer to play a language app that was all that and less of the micro questions and more of these like contextual. But again, I imagine that content is more expensive to produce.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why you don't get as much of it, or I guess they test these things and they find out what balance of things people are tolerant of. But what I wanted to ask you was, what would be a good language learning game? And if you don't know exactly what it would be, what features would it have?
If I knew, I'd be very rich. I don't know. It's a tricky question. I feel like if it was an easy answer, because if you want to make money with it, right?
Yeah.
Then there's always a trade-off between what's the best way of teaching and what's the best way for a business to make money, right?
Right. Yeah.
Which is I do think that the issue of immersion is like an important one, and I think there's something about those last two games we talked about, where you are a character in the world and you're running around and you are directly interacting with objects and actions and therefore learning the words. I think there's something about that that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that from all the ones we looked at, those two seemed to be, you know, the least polished, as you said, and it seemed like a very small team made those and that they're not doing very well.
Which is a shame because they did seem really promising. But again, they also felt like they were specifically targeted at children or younger teens because of the art style and various other things. And they also felt like...
Oh, imagine if you did like a detective fiction noir style app, and then... Yeah,
I mean, the thing about these is so focused... I guess part of this makes me think of the distinction between pedagogy and andragogy, they call it sometimes in adult learning, which is basically like it is different to teach adults, right? There are different learning principles in how you learn things when you're already an adult and you come into a classroom with a bunch of knowledge and assumptions and stuff. And one of the things I felt whenever I played those apps, and it's true of all of these, but you learn in this very nouns first way. Like everything is a concrete noun. So the length of time it would take you in Duolingo to get to the point where you're learning about how to express your emotions or anything abstract is really quite long, right? And these like physical games where you're walking around the environment and naming things, it kind of feels like how we teach toddlers in their native tongue of like,
you point at an object.
And I do think something with a heavy narrative, like the noir example you gave, that could be fantastic. Because imagine someone describing events to you, like the man hit the woman with a stick and ran off down that alleyway, right? That's a really rich sentence,
and also so relevant for the real world.
I mean, unfortunately, that is the sort of thing that happens quite frequently. But one of the things. There is this like question of like making the thing for children or making the thing for adults or trying to do both at the same time. And I think often you can't do both at the same time. So years ago when I was teaching games, we had a final year project where we would often have like a work experience project, but we didn't really want to send kids off, 21-year-olds off to game studios because they would just make tea for 2 weeks. So we would find like a client who wanted a game made. And one year we were working with a musician and they wanted us to make an ARG. So an ARG is a alternative reality game, which is or alternate reality game where the idea is that there's a big sort of treasure hunt and it's played across a mixture of like physical locations and dummy websites and stuff like this. So there might be like a Reddit set up for this game that has a clue in, that leads to a Tumblr that has a clue in, and that leads to a YouTube video that has a clue embedded on one frame. And the idea is that these games use sort of like the wisdom of crowds, and people together can solve this like 100 link chain puzzle that has such weird answers and connections in, but because they're working together they can do it, right? And I had one student, very, very bright student, that did a bunch of research on these and looked at other ones. And one of the things she found is that the narrative of all of them have some kind of peril. They have and it's similar to what they do with escape rooms, right? When you go into an escape room, it's not just a bland series of puzzles. It's like a crime has taken place here and you need to decode it, or
locked in a room
someone
and
has
you need
locked
to
you in
come out,
and they're going to kill you, right? So there's some sort of sense of peril or stakes. And I think if you wanted to make a app aimed at adults that was a really effective learning tool, having a sort of narrative that is a kind of, someone is going to die if you can't do this thing. Maybe not that extreme, but that seems to be a really good motivator for adults when it comes to doing interactive things. And that sort of, for me, highlights the distinction between designing something for kids who may actually like some peril as well, but it has to be of a different nature, right? It has to be, oh no, I'm going to lose my blanket. My ball got stuck in the tree.
Where is all my candy?
Where is all my candy?
To be fair, I would play that if it was the peril is, where is the cake?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I think one of the qualities I would like to see in learning apps is a bit more narrative integration. Where the narrative isn't just like background dressing, but it like is immersing you in a fantasy world, or it doesn't necessarily have to be fantasy in the sort of genre sense, but just it's taking me out of my current world into something. And Duolingo is like the antithesis of this, because it's sort of a sterile white environment, and there are some cute little characters in there, but they are representative of real world people. It's not like a Viking and a dragon or whatever.
It's those characters, because you have different like character images, right? You never really get a sense, or at least I don't know for how long you might need to play it, you don't get a sense of like these are like full blown like characters who have certain relationships or hobbies or whatever, where it's that you can tell from that. It's just another face telling you to say a sentence.
Well, to get that you have to read the fanfic, right?
Is that written in the target language?
that would be great if they just wrote loads of fanfic in French and put it out there and just there
probably is duo fanfic out there.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine people get very attached to certain characters in it.
No,
right?
no, I mean like
just
as in the owl.
Yeah, of course there is. Just the owl and
Peppa Pig
and the Angry Birds.
Yeah.
Let people dwell on that for as long as they need to.
If they must. I apologise.
So yeah, the summary is we are largely disappointed by
we are.
gamified language learning apps.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's all from us this time round. Remember that wherever you're listening to this, it would be great if you could give us a like or a 5-star review. We also have a Buy Me a Coffee if you want to support us financially. And if you leave us a comment on either YouTube or I guess either Spotify or
Apple
Podcast, together with a review in those cases, then we're going to read it out. And we actually have a comment to read out.
Oh, is it a nice one?
It is a nice one.
That's
and
nice.
It was commented on our Real Cultures in Games episode, which was when we talked about Thank Goodness You're Here. It's from Emily, and she says, linguist in training who plays video games here. Really enjoyed this episode. As a northerner, I had never felt so represented than when I played Thank Goodness You're Here. It brought me so much joy. All of the slang and little linguistic quirks were so lovely to see in a game.
Yeah,
I'm glad she
very
enjoyed
cute
it
game.
as much as we did. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for listening. See you next time.
Okie dokie.
Let's get it what it do.
Hello, Melody.